A fishing boat crosses a line on the water and vanishes into foam. 1 minute it rides an ordinary swell. The next it is buried under a wall of breaking sea. At the mouth of the Columbia River, the border between Washington and Oregon, that sailors call the Graveyard of the Pacific. Since 1792, an estimated 2,000 vessels and hundreds of lives have been lost here. The easy answer is big waves. The real answer is stranger. The largest river in the American West, fighting the tide. Explorers, steel ships, and the Coast Guard all entered the same trap. And that is the part almost nobody understands about this place. You look at a chart and you see a river meeting the sea, which sounds gentle, almost pastoral, the kind of thing you would put on a postcard. What you are actually looking at is one of the most concentrated collisions of moving water anywhere on the planet. A spot barely 3 miles wide where a continent drains itself into an ocean that refuses to make room. To understand why so many people died right here, at the doorstep of safety, with land in plain sight, you have to stop thinking about the ocean and start thinking about the river. Let me put you on the map first because the geography here is not decoration. It is the whole crime. The Columbia is the great river of the Pacific Northwest. It rises in the mountains of British Columbia, gathers the runoff of an area larger than France, drains parts of 7 states and a Canadian province, and after more than 1,000 miles, it arrives at the Pacific with more force than any other river on the west coast of the Americas. On an average day, it pushes more than 250,000 cubic feet of fresh water into the ocean every single second. In spring, when the snowpack of the Rockies and the Cascades melts and the whole interior lets go at once, that number climbs far higher. This is not a stream feeling its way to the sea. It is a fire hose aimed at the horizon, and it has been aimed at that exact spot, without a day off, for something like 10,000 years. And every drop of that has to squeeze out through the same narrow gate. That is the first thing to fix in your mind about the Columbia. It is enormous, and its exit is tiny. A river draining an area larger than France does not get a wide, forgiving delta here, the way the Mississippi spreads into the Gulf across 100 miles of marsh. It gets a single hard mouth barely 3 miles across, hemmed in by a headland on one side and a low sand spit on the other. And everything the river carries and everything it pushes, all that water and all that force, is jammed out through that one opening. Concentration is the whole story. Take the outflow of a continent and force it through a doorway, and the doorway becomes the most violent water for 1,000 miles. The ocean it hits is not calm either. The North Pacific manufactures swell on an industrial scale, storms that spin up off Japan, off the Aleutians, off the Gulf of Alaska, send long trains of waves marching thousands of miles east until they slam into the Oregon and Washington coast with nothing to slow them down. Most of that coastline drops off into deep water almost immediately, so the swell arrives at nearly full strength, still carrying the energy it picked up a hemisphere away. You can actually see the collision from space. The Columbia carries so much fresh water, stained brown with the silt of a continent, that where it pours into the Pacific, it does not simply blend in and disappear. It spreads out across the ocean as a great visible plume, a muddy stain fanning out for miles offshore, riding on top of the heavier salt water beneath it, with a distinct line where the river's water meets the seas. Satellites photograph it. Ships crossing outbound pass from green ocean into brown river water and back again in the space of a few minutes. That visible seam on the surface is the outward sign of the exact fight that kills people down at the bar. 2 different bodies of water, different densities, different directions, meeting in one place and flatly refusing to merge in peace. Now put those 2 things in the same doorway. On one side, a river shoving a wall of fresh water outward. On the other, an ocean shoving a wall of salt water inward. Between them, a shallow, shifting ridge of sand called a bar, thrown down by the river itself as it dropped, century after century, the sediment it carried down from the mountains. That is worth stopping on because it means the trap is self-built and self-renewing. The river spends its entire length tearing sediment off the mountains and the plains, and when it finally reaches the sea and slows, it drops that load, right there at the mouth, where the current loses its strength. 10,000 years of that dropping built the bar, and the river keeps doing it, every single day, adding to and reshaping the very shoals that wreck the ships trying to reach it. Nothing about the bar is an accident or an outside force. The Columbia builds the thing that kills at its own doorstep out of the mountains it drains, and then it drives the current that turns that sandbank into a wall of surf. The weapon and the hand that swings it are the same river, and that shifting sandbar it keeps rebuilding is the trap at the center of this whole story. Almost everything that has ever killed anyone here happens because of what those two forces, the river shoving out and the ocean shoving in, do to each other over that shallow ground. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth slowing down for because once you see it, you will never look at a river mouth the same way again. Deep water waves are long and rolling. They carry enormous energy, but that energy is spread through a tall column of water, so a big ship simply rides up one side and down the other. When one of those waves reaches the bar, the sea floor suddenly rises up beneath it. The bottom of the wave starts dragging on the sand and slows down while the top keeps moving at full speed. The wave gets shorter from front to back and taller from bottom to top. It stops rolling and starts standing up. Push it far enough, and it does what every wave eventually does when it runs out of water underneath it. It breaks. It trips over its own base and collapses forward in an avalanche of white water heavy enough to crush a deck house. That is a normal beach on a normal day. Now add the river. The Columbia's current runs seaward through this same narrow gap and on a strong ebb tide. When the falling tide and the river's own push pull in the same direction, that outbound current is commonly clocked at 4 to 7 knots, and stronger still on a big ebb. 7 knots does not sound like much. It is a brisk jog. But water is heavy, unbelievably heavy in that volume. And when a current that fast runs head-on into swell coming the other way, it does to those waves exactly what a wall does to a speeding car. The waves cannot pass cleanly through the opposing current, so they pile up against it. Their spacing collapses. Their faces steepen. A swell that would have been a long, survivable ridge out in the open ocean becomes, over the bar on an ebb, a stacked, near-vertical breaking wall. The very same wave in the very same weather is roughly twice as dangerous crossing out against the ebb as it is crossing in on a flood. The water itself decides, 6 hours out of every 12, whether you live. Put the numbers next to each other, and you can feel it in your stomach. A 7-knot ebb is water moving at roughly the pace of a person jogging, which sounds like nothing at all. Until you remember that this jogging wall of water is the entire drainage of a continent, and it is running head-on into ocean swells that may already stand 20 feet from trough to crest. The swell wants in. The river will not let it. Neither one yields, so the energy has to go somewhere, and it goes upward, into height and steepness, into a face of water that a moment earlier was a gentle ocean hill, and is now a breaking cliff standing over a boat's deck. The very same 20-foot swell that a ship would ride over out at sea without spilling a cup of coffee becomes, on the bar on a hard ebb, the thing that rolls her under. So the danger here is not the height of the waves in the abstract. It is timing and direction. It is the river turning the sea against anyone trying to leave, on a schedule set by the moon. In practice, this is why the entire rhythm of crossing the bar is built around the clock of the tide. The safest time to cross is the short window of slack water when the tide has stopped falling and the river's outrush eases before the flood pushes back in. because in that brief lull, the current is not stacking the swell into walls. Mariners here learn to plan their lives around it, to reach the bar not when it is convenient, but when the water permits, to wait out the ebb even with a harbor in plain sight. Get it right, and the same bar that would have killed you at full ebb lets you pass almost quietly. Get it wrong, arrive an hour early with the ebb still running hard, and you meet the worst version of the crossing there is. The difference between those two crossings is not the ship and not the weather. It is the timing. And timing is the one thing no engine and no hull can buy back for you once you are already committed. And it matters just as much which season you meet it in. In summer, the bar can be almost benign for weeks at a stretch. The swell low, the winds light, the crossing so easy that it lulls people into forgetting what they are crossing. The killing happens in winter when the North Pacific throws its biggest storms at the coast, and the swells arrive tall and close together and meet a river swollen with rain. Look back later at the dates in this story, and the pattern is impossible to miss. The bar does the great bulk of its work in the dark half of the year, and it does it to people who very often had no real choice about the timing, because the fish ran when they ran, and the cargoes shipped when they shipped, and the storms came when they came, and all of it collided in the same few winter months over the same 3 miles of water. During those winter storms, the waves stacking over the bar can top 40 feet, and even on ordinary winter days, they routinely run past 20. And mariners here have a word for the worst of them: sneakers. A set of waves that rears up out of nowhere, far bigger than anything around it, sometimes breaking half a mile from where the water is supposed to be, deep enough to be safe. You can be sitting in what looks like an open, quiet channel, and a sneaker will find you, and there is no warning. Only the sudden rise of the horizon, where no horizon should be. There is one more thing about these waves that the numbers hide, and it is the thing that actually sinks boats, not how tall they are, but how close together. Out in the deep ocean, the crests of a big swell can be hundreds of feet apart, what mariners call a long wavelength, giving a vessel long, easy seconds to rise and settle between them. Force that same swell up onto the shallow bar and jam it against the ebb, and those crests crowd in on one another until there is almost no gap left. The waves arrive on top of each other. A boat takes one breaking sea, and before it has shed the water and come level again, the next one is already on it, and then the one after that. That is what breaks a hull or rolls a boat, not a single monster wave in isolation, but a rapid succession of steep, heavy walls with no room to recover between them, each blow landing while the boat is still staggering from the one before, and the sand never holds still. The same current that stacks the waves also drags the bottom around, scouring a deep spot here, dumping a fresh shoal there. So the safe water is never quite where it was last season, or sometimes last week. That single fact is going to matter enormously later, so hold on to it. The ground itself moves. No chart can fully fix a bottom that rearranges itself with every big storm. And where the moving sand piles up, it leaves names on the map that read like a casualty list, because every one of them was named for something that died there. Peacock Spit, reaching miles out from the North Shore. Clatsop Spit on the Oregon side. Desdemona Sands out in the estuary. Sand Island in the middle of the mouth. These are not scenic labels. They are headstones, and by the end of this story, you will know why each of them got its name. And the count behind those names is genuinely staggering, even allowing for how slippery the numbers are. The estimate repeated most often is that something like 2,000 vessels have been lost in these waters since Gray first crossed in 1792, along with hundreds of lives, and some tallies of the wider stretch of coast run higher still. Nobody can hand you an exact figure, and anyone who claims to is guessing, because the record is 2 centuries deep and full of small boats that simply never came home and were never formally counted. But the order of magnitude is not in dispute. This is not a place that has taken a tragic handful of famous ships. It is a place that has been quietly consuming vessels, by the score and then by the hundred, for as long as outsiders have been trying to cross it, which is exactly why it earned a name usually reserved for an entire coastline, and wears it as if it belonged to this one river mouth alone. To be fair to the geography, the graveyard of the Pacific is really a long, dangerous reach of coast, extending well north and south of the river, a whole region of fog and rock and storm that has wrecked ships up and down its length. But the mouth of the Columbia is its beating heart, the single deadliest point on a deadly coast, because it is the one place where all of that open ocean danger is gathered up and then multiplied by the river. Everywhere else on that coast, a ship is fighting the sea. Here it is fighting the sea and the river at once. In a gap it cannot go around if it wants to reach the greatest port on the northwest coast. That is why, of all the places that share the grim nickname, this is the one people mean when they say it. The estuary behind the bar is wide and calm and full of promise, the water opening out toward the towns of Astoria on the Oregon shore and Ilwaco on the Washington side, with the deep channel running on inland more than 100 miles to Portland. That is the cruelty of the design. Safety is right there, visible, close enough to see chimney smoke. All you have to do to reach it is cross 3 miles of the most violent water on the coast, at the one moment the river and the tide and the swell allow it, over a bottom that will not stay put. Get the timing wrong, and the calm water you were aiming for becomes the last thing you ever see. Pull the scale in for a moment, from the satellite view down to where it actually happens. From high enough up, the mouth of the Columbia is a clean blue seam between two green shores, 3 miles of water, a shipping lane, a line on a map. Drop down to the surface and it is not clean at all. It is a churning field of standing waves and breaking crests and boils where the current tears at the bottom, stretching for miles, with no obvious path through it. Drop down further still, onto the deck of one small boat in the middle of that, and the map is gone. Entirely. There is only the next wave, and the one behind it, and the wheel in your hands, and the question of whether the water under your keel is deep enough, or whether you have drifted without seeing it onto the edge of a shoal that was somewhere else last winter. Everything in this story happens at that last scale, on that deck, in that moment. The map is for us. The people who died here were never looking at a map. They were looking at the wave, which raises the first real question of this whole story. If the danger is this consistent, this physical, this old, then the people who lived here longest must have understood it. And they did, better than anyone who came after. Long before anyone drew a chart, the Chinook people lived along both banks of this river mouth, and this was not some marginal outpost. The Lower Columbia was one of the great trading hubs of the entire Pacific Northwest, a crossroads where goods moved up and down the coast and deep into the interior, and the Chinook sat at the center of it. They were superb canoe handlers, working these waters daily in cedar canoes, moving people and cargo across an estuary that swallowed sailing ships whole, and they had leaders who understood exactly how much power sat in controlling that water. The most famous of them was Comcomly, sometimes written Concomly, the shrewd headman of the Lower Chinook at the mouth of the river in the early contact years, and one of the best-known indigenous leaders on the entire Pacific coast. Comcomly was a master trader, and he grasped a truth about this river mouth that every merchant and government after him would also grasp and never improve upon. Whoever controlled the crossing controlled the wealth that had to pass through it. He made sure that he, or one of his emissaries, often one of his wives, met the inbound ships once they were inside the bar and guided them to an anchorage near his own village, where he could manage the trade on his terms. In that sense, the very first river pilot on the Columbia was a Chinook chief, meeting ships at the bar and taking them in, generations before anyone printed a license. He received the Lewis and Clark expedition hospitably when it reached the coast in 1805, and later cultivated the American fur traders who came to plant a post at Astoria. The knowledge and the leverage were Chinook first. Everyone who came after was, in a real sense, renting them. It is worth being precise about what that Chinook seamanship actually was, because it is easy to wave at it as folklore and miss that it was hard technical mastery. The Chinook and their neighbors built large, elegant canoes out of single-seater logs, some of them big enough to carry tons of cargo and dozens of people, shaped with a high, cutting bow made for exactly this kind of steep, short, dangerous water. They worked the lower river and the estuary daily. They crossed to fish and to trade. And they moved goods along a network that reached far up the Columbia and down the coast, tied together by a trade language, later called Chinook jargon, that spread across the whole region so different peoples could deal with one another. These were not people clinging to the edge of a terrifying place. They were people who had turned the most dangerous river mouth on the coast into the front door of a thriving economy. And they had done it with no engine, no chart, no forecast, and no rescue service. On the strength of knowing the water so completely that they simply did not put themselves where it could take them. Every technology that follows in this story is, in a sense, an expensive attempt to buy back the margin of safety that knowledge gave them for free. But the heart of their skill was not power. It was reading and restraint. They knew this water the way you know a face you have looked at your whole life. They knew which stage of the tide was survivable and which was suicide. They knew the difference between the river running out with the swell and the river running out against it. They understood, without a single instrument, the thing that outsiders would spend the next 2 centuries relearning at the cost of their lives. That the bar is not crossed by force, it is crossed by timing. And the most important seamanship of all is knowing when to stay ashore. That is the knowledge the whole rest of this story keeps rediscovering the hard way. The bar does not punish weakness, it punishes bad timing. And the first outsiders who came looking for this river did not have the timing. They could not even find the door. That is where the written history begins, and it begins with failure. In the summer of 1788, an English trader and former naval officer named John Meares sailed down this coast hunting for the great river that rumor and earlier Spanish sightings had placed somewhere along here. He reached the tall headland on the north side of the entrance, looked into the churning line of breakers stretched clean across the opening, saw no obvious channel through the white water, decided there was no navigable river hiding behind all that violence, and sailed away. On his chart, he stamped the headland with a name that has stuck for more than 2 centuries. Cape Disappointment. He was wrong. The river was right there, directly behind the exact wall of breaking sea that had convinced him nothing worth entering could possibly be there. The bar had done its first documented job. It had made one of the largest rivers on the continent effectively invisible to a professional mariner who was looking straight at it. Think about how strange that is. Not a hidden creek, not a marsh you could miss in the fog. One of the largest rivers in North America by volume, draining a chunk of a continent. And an experienced captain stared right at its mouth and concluded it was not there, because the entrance defends itself with the same breakers that would later kill people by the hundreds. The thing that makes the Columbia deadly is the same thing that kept it secret. Remember that, because it is the pattern under everything. Here, the danger and the value are never 2 different things. They are always the same thing, seen from 2 sides. It took 4 more years and a different kind of captain to get in. On the 11th of May, 1792, an American fur trader named Robert Gray, commanding a ship called the Columbia Rediviva, worked his vessel across the bar and into the estuary. Gray was not a naval explorer or a scientist. He was a merchant chasing sea otter pelts, and he had been probing this coast precisely because a river mouth meant fresh water, trade, and shelter from the open sea. He watched the bar, he read the water, he picked his moment, and he drove through. He spent about 9 days inside, trading with the Chinook, and before he left, he formally named the river after his ship, the Columbia. That crossing is the reason an American name sits on the river today, and a large part of the reason the United States could later claim this whole corner of the continent all the way to the Pacific. A merchant captain succeeded exactly where a naval officer had given up, and the difference between them was not courage or skill in the ordinary sense. It was the willingness to wait for the water to say yes. Later that same year, a British expedition under George Vancouver, following up on Gray's report, sent Lieutenant William Broughton back across the bar to survey up the river in detail. The British had sailed right past it. The Americans had gone in and claimed it, and already, in the very first decade of contact, the entire logic of this place was set. Getting to the Columbia was never really the problem. Getting across its threshold was the problem. The river was a prize sitting behind a moat that opened and closed strictly on its own schedule, and no amount of wanting it changed the schedule by a minute. You can measure the mouth's violence by who it humbled, and one of the first it humbled was the most famous expedition in American history. In November of 1805, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and their Corps of Discovery came down the last miles of the Columbia, with the Pacific finally in reach, after crossing an entire continent on foot and by canoe. And the mouth of the river stopped them cold. A run of savage winter storms pinned the party against the Washington shore, in a cramped, dripping niche of rock just above the estuary for the better part of a week, from around the 10th to the 15th of November. They could not go forward, and they could not go back. Waves driven by the wind hurled whole drift logs into their camp in the dark, so that men had to scramble in the middle of the night to keep from being crushed by trees the river was throwing at them. Their food ran out. Their clothes, soaked for days on end, literally rotted off their bodies. Clark, a hard man not given to whining, wrote in his journal that a feeling person would be distressed by their situation, and he named the place, with bitter accuracy, that dismal little niche. Dismal Niche it has been called ever since. And this was not even the bar itself. This was the sheltered water inside, and it still very nearly broke the expedition that had survived the whole American West to reach it. When the weather finally cracked, they slipped across to calmer water and made their winter camp. And the men who had walked from the Mississippi to the ocean had learned in 6 miserable days exactly what the Chinook already knew in their bones. At the mouth of the Columbia, the water sets the schedule. You wait on its permission, or you pay. The first blood the written record clearly counts was spilled just a few years later, and the men who spilled it were the first Americans who came to stay. In March of 1811, a ship called the Tonquin arrived off the mouth of the Columbia, sent by the New York fur baron John Jacob Astor to plant a trading post on the river. Her commander, Captain Jonathan Thorne, faced the identical problem Mears had faced and Gray had beaten. He had to find the channel through the breakers, so he did what ships did in that age. He sent men out ahead of the ship in small boats to row into the surf and sound the bar by hand, feeling for the deep water with a lead line, while the sea heaved around them. It went about as badly as you would fear. One boat, sent out with 5 men aboard, was swallowed by the breakers and lost. The next day another boat was sent and fought the bar and got nowhere. A third finally traced the channel, but was swamped on its way back to the ship, and more men went into the water. By the time the Tonquin herself crossed the bar and came to anchor in the calm of Baker Bay, she had lost 8 of her people, drowned in the surf at the entrance, and only 2 of their bodies were ever found. The Americans had not yet set a single boot on the shore they had come to claim, and the bar had already taken 8 of them, purely for the crime of trying to find the door. And here is the detail that tells you everything about why this story never ends. It did not stop them. The survivors went ashore and built their post anyway, and named it Astoria, and it is often called the first permanent American settlement on the whole Pacific coast. 8 men drowned at the threshold, and the response was not to turn back. The response was to plant a town on the riverbank and start sending more ships across the same bar, because the fur and the timber and the salmon and the deep water inland were worth it, and always would be. That is the oldest bargain on this river, and it was signed in the very first year anyone tried to live here. The prize is worth the toll, and the toll is collected at the bar. Even so, for many years, there were few such losses because the traffic itself was thin. A handful of fur ships a year, captains who could afford to stand off and wait days for the bar to lie down because they had nowhere they urgently needed to be. The trap was fully loaded, but the exposure was small. Then the country arrived, in numbers, in a hurry, with money on the line, and the exposure exploded, and the bar began collecting the ships it is still remembered for. The first of the truly famous wrecks was not a merchantman caught out by weather. It was the United States Navy, at the height of its confidence, with some of the best-trained officers in the country aboard. In 1841, the United States Exploring Expedition, a sprawling naval and scientific voyage under Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, was working its way along the Pacific coast, charting, surveying, collecting. One of its ships was the sloop of war USS Peacock, an 18-gun vessel commanded by Lieutenant William L. Hudson. These were professional naval seamen doing exactly the careful, methodical work you would trust with a difficult entrance. Men whose entire training was in not making mistakes with a ship. On the 18th of July, 1841, the Peacock came in to cross the Columbia Bar. She never made it. The channel was not where the existing charts said it should be, because the charts could not possibly keep up with the moving sand, and the Peacock ran hard onto a shoal on the north side of the entrance. The instant she stopped, the sea took over. The same breakers that had fooled Meares half a century earlier now had a warship pinned in the shallows, and every wave that rolled in lifted her stern and dropped her whole weight back onto the bottom. The crew fought her for the better part of a day, running out anchors, trying to haul her off, trying to lighten her, trying everything a well-drilled naval crew knows how to do. And none of it worked, because none of it could. The Peacock pounded herself apart where she lay. For a naval expedition that had crossed half the world's oceans measuring and charting and collecting specimens, to lose one of its ships, not to a battle or a hurricane, but to a sandbar at the mouth of an American river, was a hard and humbling thing. And it cost them the vessel and much of what she carried. Here is the part that matters. Every man aboard survived. They got off in the ship's boats, worked their way to shore, and the human cost that day was 0. But the ship, a commissioned warship of the United States Navy, was a total loss, ground to splinters on a sandbar by a river she had merely tried to enter, and the shoal that destroyed her took her name and has carried it ever since. Peacock Spit. That submerged tongue of sand reaching miles out from the North Shore, the one I told you to remember, is named for the first famous ship it killed, and it was only getting started. Before this story is over, Peacock Spit will take a great deal more than a warship. That wreck ends the opening chapter of this place, and it ends it on a reversal that reorganizes everything. The lesson of the Peacock was not that the Navy was careless. The Navy was excellent, and it still lost the ship. The lesson was that excellence in a ship was simply not the answer, because the danger was never really about the ship at all. It was about the water, and the water changed faster than any survey on Earth could record. You could build a stronger vessel, train a sharper crew, draw a more careful chart, and the sand would quietly rearrange itself under all of it between one crossing and the next. What this river mouth actually demanded was not a better ship. It was somebody who read the bar the way the Chinook read it, in real time, every day, and knew on any given hour where the safe water had moved to. Out of that hard need, out of the wreckage of ships exactly like the Peacock, an entire profession was born. One of the oldest and strangest reasons anyone survives this crossing at all. They are called the Columbia River Bar Pilots. The idea was older than the profession. When the first trading ships arrived, it was local native men and later employees of the Hudson's Bay Company operating out of the region who went out to meet incoming vessels and guide them across, because they were the only ones who actually knew where the water was safe. By 1846, that improvised arrangement had hardened into a formal system of pilotage. By the early 1850s, the authorities in Oregon had begun formally licensing bar pilots, and out of that first handful of licensed men, one figure came to tower over all the rest: Captain George Flavel. Flavel had reached Astoria around 1849, an experienced sea captain who had sailed around Cape Horn and passed through the California Gold Rush, and once he held a pilot's license, he and his partners built something close to a monopoly on guiding ships across the Columbia Bar and up the river. Accounts differ on exactly who held the very first license, some crediting Flavel with license number 1, and others naming an earlier licensed pilot. And I am not going to pretend that detail is settled when it is not. But no one disputes what Flavel became. He dominated bar pilotage, then Astoria commerce itself, built a steam tug in 1869 to run as his pilot boat, and grew into one of the richest and most powerful men in all of Oregon. His Victorian mansion still standing in Astoria as a museum today. Long after his death, his widow was asked why he had succeeded on the bar where others failed, and her answer is the entire job compressed into a sentence. He was not only an able navigator, she said, but he was fearless, and he was willing to put out in any sort of weather to help vessels in need. That willingness to go out into precisely the water everyone else is fleeing is the beating heart of every pilot and every rescuer in this whole story. The principle was simple, and it has never once changed in nearly 2 centuries. An incoming ship, no matter how large, no matter how experienced her own captain, stops at the bar and takes aboard a local pilot whose entire working life is spent studying this one short, lethal stretch of water. The pilot, not the captain, cons the ship across. The captain knows his vessel better than anyone alive, but the pilot knows the bar, and on the Columbia, the bar is the thing that kills you. For most of that history, simply getting the pilot aboard was one of the most dangerous jobs on the coast. The pilot had to be carried out to the waiting ship in a small boat, run in close alongside a moving vessel in a heaving sea, and then climb a swinging rope ladder up the side of a steel hull while both boat and ship rose and fell on the swell, sometimes 10 or 15 feet at a time. Time the jump wrong, and you go into the water in the narrow gap between the pilot boat and the ship's hull, which is very close to the worst place a human being can be. Pilots were injured doing this. Pilots died doing this. Today, much of that transfer is done by helicopter, lowering the pilot straight down onto the deck of a ship still some 15 miles offshore, before she ever reaches the close, unforgiving water near the entrance. That is a real and genuine improvement, and we are going to come back to precisely what it did and did not solve, because it is the whole modern story in miniature. Here's the thing to understand about the pilots, and about every clever solution that follows them in this story. They reduced the risk. They did not remove it, and they could not. Because a pilot can tell you where the safe water is today, but a pilot cannot make the ocean smaller or the river weaker. A pilot only helps a ship that is under control. The bar's real appetite has always been for the boats that lose control, the ones caught by weather that turns a routine crossing into a fight for the hull. The ones that gamble on crossing without a pilot at all because waiting costs money. And the bar, from a distance, on a fair morning, looks like nothing. And that last mistake has a name too, out in the estuary, on the map, where a bark called the Desdemona left her own headstone in the sand. On New Year's Day of 1857, the Desdemona, a bark built in Maine, came up on the mouth of the Columbia inbound for Astoria. Her captain made a choice that made perfect economic sense right up until it didn't. He decided to cross the bar and work up to Astoria without waiting for a pilot to come out and take him in. Every hour he saved was money in someone's pocket. He knew the destination. He could see where he wanted to go. And the bar did not look like much. So he went in on his own judgment, without the one man whose job was to know where the channel had moved to that week. And the Desdemona ran aground on a shoal in the estuary and could not get off. The crew was taken off and survived, though one man drowned in the effort and the ship was lost where she stuck. The shoal has been called Desdemona Sands ever since, and decades later the government would build a lighthouse standing right on it, a lit monument marking the exact spot where a captain decided he did not need local knowledge and was proven wrong before he ever reached town. The Desdemona did not die in a storm or on the outer bar. She died in the calmer water inside, killed by nothing more dramatic than the decision to skip the one safeguard this river demands. That is the quiet lesson under the Desdemona, and it is worth saying flatly. On this river, the safeguard is not optional equipment. It is the difference between arriving and becoming a place name. The captain who skips the pilot to save a few hours is making a bet that the channel is exactly where he last saw it, and that the water will behave. And on the Columbia, both of those bets come up wrong often enough to fill a graveyard. The Desdemona did not die spectacularly. She died of a small, reasonable-sounding economy in calm water, within sight of the town she was trying to reach. So the pilot is the answer. Take the pilot and you live. Skip the pilot and you join the map. If only it were that clean. Because the bar had a colder lesson waiting, and it taught it with one of the largest ships ever to come near the river, fully piloted, crossing at the safest possible moment, with almost 900 people aboard. The Great Republic was a giant of her day, a sidewheel steamer close to 380 feet long, running the coastal route between Portland and San Francisco. On the 19th of April, 1879, she came down the river outbound, crowded with people, and by the accounts that survive, she carried something on the order of 890 passengers and crew. She did everything right on paper. She had a bar pilot aboard, the very safeguard the Desdemona had gone without, and she timed her crossing for high tide, when the water over the bar is deepest and the danger is lowest. And she still went aground on Sand Island, right in the mouth of the river. According to the accounts, the pilot put her onto the sand despite warnings from the captain, a disagreement on the bridge, in the worst possible place to have one. And the argument did not matter once the hull stopped moving. She was stuck. Think about that scene on the bridge for a second. The one man aboard whose whole authority was the ship, and the one man aboard whose whole authority was the bar, standing a few feet apart, disagreeing about where the safe water lay, in the exact minutes when being wrong meant a wreck. That is the permanent tension buried inside the entire pilot system, and usually it resolves in the pilot's favor because usually the pilot is right about the bar. Here, by the accounts that come down to us, it did not, and close to 900 people paid the price of that argument, saved only because the ship happened to ground where boats could still reach her. Sand Island, sitting right in the middle of the mouth, has been catching ships that guessed wrong about the channel for as long as there has been traffic on this river, and the Great Republic is only its most crowded near miss. Now watch how this one plays out differently, because it teaches something the Peacock did not. The Great Republic did not break up in the first hour. She went aground in relatively reachable water with plenty of daylight and plenty of help nearby, and so the captain did the thing a captain does when the ship is lost, but the people are not yet. He got the people off. Local boats came out from Astoria, and nearly 900 passengers were ferried to safety, an evacuation that by any measure was a triumph, a disaster that killed almost no one. Almost, because the crew stayed aboard afterward, trying to refloat her, trying to save the ship itself, and while they worked, the weather turned, and the sea began breaking the Great Republic apart under them. In the end, 11 of them drowned, abandoning the wreck they had stayed behind to save. Sit with the shape of that. 890 people in mortal danger, and the story is remembered as a rescue, because the passengers lived. 11 men died anyway, and every one of them died not in the grounding, but in the attempt to salvage the vessel, after the people were already safe. The bar did not need a storm or a navigation blunder to kill here. It took a fully piloted ship at high tide and still found its 11 in the gap between saving the people and saving the ship. That is the lesson the Great Republic adds to the pile. A pilot improves your odds, but a pilot is a human being making a judgment call on a moving deck. And the bar punishes a bad judgment exactly as hard as it punishes no judgment at all. And even a near-perfect outcome, hundreds saved, leaves bodies in the water. Because the moment the objective shifts from saving people to saving property, the bar collects its fee. You might reasonably ask at this point why anyone kept doing this, why a sane person would keep loading ships and families and fortunes onto a stretch of water that so reliably destroyed them. And the answer is the same answer it always is at a dangerous place worth reaching, because everything on the other side was worth money, and a great deal of it. The Columbia is not just a dangerous river, it is a spectacularly rich one, and the two facts are the same fact wearing different clothes. The same enormous flow that stacks the killing waves also carved and maintains a deep, navigable channel running far inland, more than 100 miles up to Portland. That made the Columbia the single highway for the wealth of an entire region. Down that river came the wheat of the inland plains, loaded aboard tall ships bound around the world. Down it came the timber of the great Northwest forests, whole cargoes of Douglas fir. And down it, above all in the early years, came the salmon, the legendary runs of the Columbia, netted by the thousands of tons, and sealed into cans by a booming industry that shipped Columbia River salmon to dinner tables across the planet. Every one of those cargoes had to cross the bar. There was no other way out. And everything the region needed to grow, every tool and rail and barrel and passenger, had to cross the bar coming in. The entire wealth of the interior had to squeeze through the most dangerous doorway on the west coast of the continent, twice, going and coming. So the pressure to cross was relentless, and it was never abstract. A salmon cannery lived and died on a season, and fish left waiting turned to garbage. A wheat ship sailed under a charter that cost real money for every day it sat hove to offshore, waiting for the bar to lie down. A steamer had a schedule and paying passengers who expected to reach San Francisco on time. Later, a fishing boat had a market that paid best early, before the whole fleet got its catch to the dock. Waiting for a perfect bar was not free. Waiting could be the difference between a profitable voyage and a ruinous one, between a season that fed a family and one that broke it, and the town that grew rich on all of it. Astoria, on the Oregon side, just inside the bar, became one of the busiest ports on the Pacific coast, crowded with canneries and sailing ships and the pilots and tugmen who made their living off the crossing. Every fortune in that town, every cannery payroll, and every merchant's warehouse full of goods depended on ships making it across the bar and back. Which means the entire economy of the lower Columbia was built directly on top of the most dangerous 3 miles of water on the coast, and everyone in it knew the deal they had made. The wealth and the graveyard were never two places. They were one place, seen in two moods. That economic pressure is the invisible hand shoving on nearly every disaster in this story. Again and again, people did not cross the bar because they were reckless idiots. They crossed because staying put had a cost too. And on any given morning, the bar looked crossable, right up until the exact moment it wasn't. Picture the pressure the way the men who actually felt it did. A wheat ship lies off the bar in the autumn, chartered by the day, her owners paying whether she moves or not, a cargo waiting up at Portland, and a schedule set months earlier in an office thousands of miles away by people who have never once seen a breaking sea. The bar has been closed for 2 days. It looks, this particular morning, like it might just be crossable. Every hour of waiting is money leaving somebody's pocket. And every captain on that coast knows other captains who crossed on mornings that looked exactly like this one and made it in without a scratch. Or picture a cannery at the peak of the salmon run, the fish coming in faster than they can be shipped. A boat that needs to get out and back before the catch spoils, and the whole season's profit rots on the dock. None of these people are fools, and none of them are gamblers by temperament. They are ordinary people, standing at the edge of a decision, where waiting carries a real and countable cost, and crossing carries a risk that most days never comes due. That is the exact machinery that fed the graveyard. Not stupidity, arithmetic, run by people with something to lose either way. Faced with all that carnage and all that money, people did what people do. They tried to engineer their way out of it. And the first thing they tried was to make the invisible door visible, so that at least no one would die simply for failing to find it in the dark. They built lighthouses. The first and oldest was on Cape Disappointment itself, authorized in the wave of the very first lighthouses on the West Coast, and first lit in October of 1856, still standing today as the oldest operating lighthouse in the Pacific Northwest. On paper, it should have fixed the problem Mears had, the problem of a river mouth you cannot see until you are in it, and it helped, from the south and from directly offshore. But the sea is never that easy here. Mariners coming down from the north, running the long, straight beach of what is now the Long Beach Peninsula, complained that they could not see the Cape Disappointment light until they were nearly on top of the river, which for a ship being pushed toward a lee shore in bad weather is far too late. The wrecks piling up along that northern beach proved them right. So the government built a second light, North Head, out on the bluff north of the Cape, first lit in May of 1898. Specifically to be seen by ships approaching from the north before the coast could trap them, and they kept building. Point Adams on the Oregon side in the 1870s. Out on a bare rock a mile offshore, south of the entrance, they built Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, lit in 1881, a light so brutally exposed to the open Pacific that the men who built it and manned it earned it the grim nickname Terrible Tilly. A station where storm waves routinely broke clean over the top of the tower, well over 100 feet above the water, and drove rock and debris through the thick glass of the lantern room itself, the one light that was supposed to be beyond the sea's reach. Building that light was its own act of near madness. The rock stood off a brutal shore, and merely landing the workers and their stone and iron on it, from boats rising and falling on the open swell, took months and nearly killed men before a single wall went up. If the ocean could throw stones through the lamp room of a lighthouse bolted onto solid rock 100 feet up, you begin to understand what it did to wooden hulls and steel plates trying to cross the bar a few miles away. And out on the bar approaches, they eventually stationed lightships, floating lighthouses anchored in the open sea to mark the entrance, manned by crews who rode out the same weather that sank everyone else, just to hold a light in place where no rock existed to build on. The Columbia River Lightship became one of the most storied stations on the coast, and holding an anchored ship on its mark off that bar in winter was its own quiet act of endurance. Those lightships were a small world of danger and boredom stitched together. A crew lived aboard a ship built to go nowhere, anchored out in the open Pacific off one of the worst bars on the coast, riding out gales on a single chain, their entire purpose to be a fixed, trustworthy light and a foghorn in the murk, so that other ships could find the entrance or stay clear of it. And if the anchor dragged in a hard storm, the lightship herself could end up on the very shoals she was stationed there to mark. They held that post off the Columbia in one form or another for the better part of a century until 1979, when the last Columbia lightship was finally retired and replaced by a big automated navigation buoy that needs no crew and risks no lives. That single swap is the whole modern era in miniature. The buoy is safer, cheaper, and tireless, and it never once has to send a man out on a heaving deck in a gale. It also cannot see, cannot judge, cannot decide, and cannot pull a drowning fisherman out of the surf. We keep replacing the parts of this system that put human beings in danger, and we keep rediscovering that the parts that actually save lives are exactly the ones that still demand a human being go out into the water and risk everything. Now here is the reversal, and it is a subtle, permanent one that runs straight through to today. Every one of those lights worked exactly as designed, and not one of them made the water any safer. A lighthouse solves the problem of not knowing where the danger is. It does absolutely nothing about the danger itself. You can see Cape Disappointment blazing away. You can see North Head. You can know your position on the chart to the yard, and the ebb still stacks the swell into a wall. The sneaker still rears up in the channel. The sand still moves. Lights turned an invisible trap into a visible one. A visible trap is better. It is not the same as an escape. Every wreck from here forward happened to men who could see exactly where they were, and it did not save them because knowing where the danger is has never been the hard part on the Columbia. Surviving it is the hard part, and no lamp on a headland changes that. So they went further. If you cannot calm the water, and you cannot simply see your way out of it, then maybe you can rebuild the door itself. Starting in 1885, the United States Army Corps of Engineers began one of the great engineering projects on the American coast, the Columbia River jetties. The idea was rooted in the physics we have already walked through. The river's flow scours the channel. So if you could concentrate that flow, force all of it through a narrower, better defined gap instead of letting it spread and wander across the whole 3-mile mouth, the concentrated current would dig its own channel deeper and hold it in place, and ships would have a reliable, mapped path across the bar that did not shift with every storm. To do it, they built enormous walls of piled stone reaching out from both shores. First a jetty out from the south side, begun in 1885. Then a great jetty out from Cape Disappointment on the north. In time, the system would total close to 10 miles of piled basalt. The work was staggering. Before they could place a single stone in the open sea, they had to build a timber trestle out over the water so that trains could run out along it, loaded with rock quarried and hauled from inland, and dump boulders weighing many tons into the surf, over and over, for years. It was dangerous, grinding, unglamorous labor, done by men on trestles out over cold and moving water, running trains loaded with stone into the teeth of the weather, placing rock that the next storm might scatter before they had finished the section. It went on, season after season, for decades. There is a particular kind of stubbornness in that, in deciding that if the ocean would not let ships cross the bar safely, then you would simply rebuild the bar itself, one 20-ton boulder at a time, until the river ran where you told it to run. In the first decade of work on the South Jetty alone, they laid down something like 940,000 tons of rock. Slowly, mile by mile, the jetties reached out into the Pacific, and slowly the river responded exactly as the engineers had hoped, scouring its confined channel down to 30 feet at low tide and deeper, opening a dependable highway for the ever larger ships of the 20th century. By 1917, the main structures were essentially complete, and the mouth of the Columbia had been physically, permanently reshaped by human hands. It is one of the most impressive things ever done to an American coastline, and the bar is still called the Graveyard of the Pacific. That is the whole thing again. The third time now in a new disguise. The jetties did what they were built to do. They made the channel deeper, straighter, and far more reliable, and modern commerce on the river genuinely depends on them. But they did not and could not calm the bar in a storm. Concentrate 250,000 cubic feet of water per second into a narrower gap, and you have not weakened the collision between river and ocean. You have focused it. In some conditions, the seas at the entrance are made steeper, not gentler, by all that confined energy tearing out through the gap. And the jetties themselves became a permanent open wound in the maintenance budget, because the same ocean that kills ships also chews the 10-ton stones out of those walls year after year, so that more than a century later, crews are still out there, still barging in fresh rock, still fighting to keep the jetties from breaching, in a battle against the sea that quite literally never ends. In recent years, the Corps has had to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into rebuilding sections that a century of Pacific storms had ground down and broken through, because if the jetties fail, the channel they hold in place begins to wander again, and the deep, dependable highway the whole river economy relies on starts to close. Sit with what that means. We did not build the jetties once and win. We built them, and then we committed ourselves permanently to fighting the ocean forever just to keep them standing, spending fortunes every few decades only to hold the line we first drew in 1917. The bar did not accept the jetties as a peace treaty. It accepted them as the opening move in a war with no end, and every ton of rock we have added since is just another year's rent on a channel the sea is always trying to take back. And the river that feeds the bar is not even the same river Robert Gray crossed, though the change is invisible from the deck of a boat. Over the last century, the Columbia has been dammed again and again, Bonneville and Grand Coulee and dozens more, until it is one of the most heavily engineered rivers on the planet. Those dams did something to the bar that no one crossing it can see. They trapped its sediment. The great load of sand and silt the river once hauled down from the mountains, the very material that built the bar and fed the beaches on both sides of the mouth for thousands of years, is now largely caught behind concrete hundreds of miles upstream. The dams also shave down the river's wild seasonal peaks, flattening the enormous spring floods that used to come tearing through the gap. Scientists tracking the coastline on either side of the mouth have watched the shore quietly recede, the sand supply pinched off at once by the dams, the dredging, and the jetties. It is a strange, slow reversal to sit with. For 2 centuries, people fought the bar's sediment and its floods as the enemy. Now we have quietly starved it of both, and the coast around the graveyard is adjusting to a river that carries less sand and floods less hard than it did when it was breaking sailing ships, without becoming 1 degree safer to cross. The sea state on the bar does not care how much sand is in the water. The ebb still runs against the swell. The gap is still 3 miles wide. You can re-engineer an entire river 1,000 miles inland, and the last 3 miles of it will still be exactly as willing to kill you as they were the morning John Mears turned away. We rebuilt the mouth of the river. The river said thank you, took the deeper channel, and kept right on killing people at the same address. Because by the time the jetties were finished, the ships had changed again, and the change that was supposed to save them carried them, once more, deeper into the trap. For the whole age of sail, a ship approaching the Columbia in bad weather faced a specific, terrible bind. The wind that was strong enough to be dangerous was very often blowing out of the west, straight on shore, which meant the same wind carrying the ship toward the shelter of the river was also carrying it toward the beach, and a sailing ship cannot go straight into the wind. If she could not claw far enough to windward to line up the entrance, the shore caught her every time. Then came steam, and then diesel, and the engine cut that knot clean through. An engine let a captain hold his ship's head to the sea, drive straight through the bar under power, regardless of wind direction, pick his moment, and stop fearing that the wind pushing him towards safety would also pin him on the sand. That is a real, life-saving advance, and it kept many ships off the beach that sail would have lost. Look, though, at what it also did. An engine let ships attempt the bar in conditions no sailing master would ever have tried, which meant that ships were now out on the bar, under power, in weather that the age of sail would have spent hove to offshore, waiting it out. And an engine, however powerful, still cannot climb a breaking sea over a shoal. When the machinery failed, when a shaft snapped or a boiler died, or the steering carried away, or when a wave simply arrived taller than the bow could rise to, the engine-driven ship was right back where the sailing Peacock had been, aground and helpless. Only now it was there in weather sail would never have risked in the first place. The tool that freed ships from the wind quietly extended their reach into exactly the conditions most likely to kill them. That trade, the solution that solves one danger and enlarges another, is the single most important pattern in this entire story, and it is about to run 3 more times in a row, each one worse than the last. Keep the shape of that trade in mind, because it is the trap hidden inside the trap. Every improvement here is real. The engine really did free ships from the wind. The radio really did let a dying ship be heard. The forecast really can see a storm coming days out, and each one, by making the crossing feel more controllable, quietly convinced people to attempt it in conditions their grandfathers would have flatly refused, or carried them one step farther from shelter, or told them a truth they no longer had the time to act on. The bar does not defeat our technology by overpowering it. It defeats it by waiting for the exact gap each new tool leaves open. And there is always a gap. The wrecks that people remember most from this stretch of the river's history come almost as a matched set, and the pairing is the point. One is the wreck where everybody lived and the ship stayed forever. One is the wreck where the new technology worked perfectly and everybody died anyway. And a third sits between them, an oil tanker breaking up in a gale, while the whole coast heard her call for help and could not find her in the dark. Start with the gentle one, because it is the most famous wreck on this coast, and you can still walk out at low tide and put your hand on it. The Peter Iredale was a 4-masted steel bark, a big, modern, ocean-crossing sailing ship, the last and finest generation of commercial sail before the engine took over entirely. In the autumn of 1906, she sailed north from Salina Cruz in Mexico, bound for Portland to load a cargo of wheat. She carried a crew of 27, a couple of stowaways among them, and about 1,000 tons of ballast to hold her steady with her holds empty. The voyage up the coast to Boychat was routine. Then, late on the night of the 25th of October, 1906, she came up on the mouth of the Columbia. Her captain, a seasoned master named Lawrence, was doing everything by the book. He sighted the light on Tillamook Rock, that hard-won beacon out on its lonely stack, and he used it to fix his position and turn in to line up for the river. But the conditions were closing around him as he did it. A thick mist rolled in and swallowed the coast. The wind came up strong out of the west, driving in off the open ocean, pushing his ship toward the land, the exact old trap of the age of sail. He tried to wear the ship around to swing her head away from the shore and buy himself sea room. And then a heavy squall out of the northwest slammed into her, and the wind and the rising tide together drove the Peter Iredale up onto the sands of Clatsop Spit, on the Oregon side, about 4 miles south of the channel he had been aiming for. She struck hard enough to bring her mast down, and she dug into the sand. And the surf went to work on her, but for once, the story bends toward mercy. She had grounded on a long open beach rather than out on the killing shoals, close enough to shore that help could reach her fast. The life-saving crew came, lines went across, and every single one of the 27 people aboard came off alive. The story handed down is that Captain Lawrence gathered his men on the sand, having lost his ship but not one soul, and offered a last toast to her before they turned and walked away up the beach. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that toast. A captain stands on a beach beside the wreck of his own ship, everyone alive, the vessel finished, and the only thing left to do is raise a glass to her and walk away. It is the one wreck in this whole story that gets to end like that gently, with no bodies in the surf, and the reason it is remembered so fondly is precisely that it is the exception. The Peter Iredale is beloved because she is the wreck that let everybody live. The bar allowed it that once, on an open beach, in reachable water, and then went straight back to its usual arithmetic a few miles up the sand. And here is the reversal, quiet and cold, under the postcard. The crew lived and the ship stayed, and her steel is exactly the reason she is still there. She was too far up the sand to refloat and too expensive to be worth dragging off, so she was simply left where she lay. More than a century later, the rusted ribs and bow of the Peter Iredale still sit on the beach at Fort Stevens, one of the most photographed shipwrecks in America, and children climb on her at low tide. And no one taking those pictures is in the slightest danger. She sits now inside Fort Stevens State Park on the Oregon side of the mouth, a short walk from the old coastal gun batteries in the South Jetty, and on a summer afternoon the beach around her is full of families and dogs and cameras. It is one of the strangest juxtapositions on the whole coast. A few hundred yards of sand separate a cheerful tourist scene from the working edge of the deadliest bar in the country, and most of the people photographing the wreck have no idea that the gentle-looking water just offshore is the same water that has swallowed something like 2,000 vessels. The Peter Iredale has been so thoroughly tamed into a postcard that she now hides, in plain sight, the very danger that put her there. She makes the whole bar look survivable, even charming. That is her lie, because her real lesson is that she was one of the strongest ships of her age, steel-hulled and well-handled, and none of that strength saved the ship. It only meant she broke slowly enough for the people to get off. Steel did not defeat the bar. It just moved the loss from the crew onto the hull alone. The trap was every bit as strong as it had ever been. The Peter Iredale got lucky with where she hit and when, and luck is not a plan. And 7 years later, a few miles north, the luck ran the other way, hard. On the 7th of January, 1913, the steam tanker Rosecrans came up toward the Columbia inbound from Monterey, California, carrying 19,000 barrels of fuel oil to Portland. She was a modern powered ship, and she carried the newest safety technology of her age, the thing that was supposed to make wrecks like the Iowa impossible ever again. A wireless set, a radio, a way to reach out across miles of black water and call for help. She would need it, and it would not be enough. She came up on the river in a whole gale, winds screaming in the 55 to 60 mile an hour range, and in that chaos, she was driven onto Peacock Spit, the same tongue of sand that had taken the USS Peacock 72 years earlier and would take the Iowa 23 years later. Her hull hung up on the shoal, and the sea began tearing her apart. And her wireless operator did exactly what the technology promised. He got a signal out. He told the world the Rosecrans was stranded somewhere near the entrance to the Columbia and was breaking up. The message was heard. Help was raised. Rescuers put to sea. They could not find her. That is the horror of the Rosecrans, and it is a different horror than the Iowas. It was not simply that the water was too rough to cross, though it was. It was that in the thick, howling weather, in the dark, with the spray flying and the visibility gone, the rescuers could not locate the wrecked ship at all. They knew she was out there dying. They had heard her say so, and the sea gave them nothing to steer for. The Rosecrans foundered on the spit while men who wanted to save her searched blind for her in the storm. Of her 36 crew, 33 died. The oil she carried came out of her ruptured hull and fouled the beaches of Washington and Oregon for months. blackening the same sand the bodies were washing up on. 19,000 barrels is a great deal of oil, and it was a foretaste of a kind of disaster the rest of the century would come to know all too well. The wreck that goes on poisoning the coast long after the people are dead. By lives lost, the Rosecrans stands as one of the very worst disasters in the bar's 20th century history. 3 men lived, and how they lived tells you everything about where the line between death and survival actually runs here. 2 of them, a quartermaster named John Slinning and a carpenter called Brick Lundmark, climbed up into the ship's rigging above the breaking seas and clung there, in a whole gale, in January, for hours, until the life-saving crew from the Point Adams station finally reached the wreck and plucked them down out of the ropes. The 3rd quartermaster, Fred Peters, was washed off the ship and survived more than 5 hours in that freezing water before he drifted ashore alive on a floating plank. 6 bodies of the 33 lost were ever recovered. The rest the bar kept. Understand what surviving that actually took. The water off the Columbia in January is cold enough to drain the strength out of a strong man in minutes and kill him not very long after. To live through it, you had to climb up out of the water into the rigging above the breaking seas, and then hold on, soaked and freezing and hammered by spray in a full gale, in the dark, hour after hour, with no promise that anyone would ever reach you, while the ship you clung to came apart under your feet. 2 men did exactly that until the surf boat finally came. A 3rd stayed alive in the water itself for more than 5 hours before a floating plank and the run of the tide happened to carry him onto a beach instead of out to sea. That is the razor these stories balance on. Not skill in the end, and not courage, though both bought time. Simply weather the cold, and the sea and the luck ran out a few minutes before help arrived, or a few minutes after. Hold on to those Point Adams lifesavers who climbed the surf to pull 2 frozen men out of the rigging, because they are the ancestors of the darkest part of this whole story. In 1913, they were the United States Life-Saving Service, men who rowed open surf boats into breaking water to reach wrecks that everyone else had written off. Within a few years, that service would merge into a new organization called the United States Coast Guard. Those men, the surfmen of the Life-Saving Service and the Coast Guard that grew out of it, worked under an old and grim unofficial motto that tells you everything about the job. You have to go out, they said, but you do not have to come back. It was not bravado. It was a plain description of the arrangement they had accepted. When a ship was dying in the surf, the rule was that you launched regardless, because someone out there was counting on the light on the shore, turning into a boat. Whether the boat and its crew came back was a separate question, and the sea, not the men, would answer it. They rowed open boats into breaking seas. They rigged lines across the surf to haul survivors ashore one at a time in a canvas sling. And they did it in the same water that was tearing the ships apart, on the working theory that a trained crew in a purpose-built boat could survive what a foundering merchantman could not. Most of the time they were right. On the worst nights, as the Triumph would prove decades later, they were not, and the sea took the rescuers along with everyone else. And half a century after the Rosecrans, on this same bar, the descendants of those Point Adams surfmen would go out one more time to save a disabled boat, in a self-righting motor lifeboat built for exactly that fight. And the bar would prove that even they, even the best-trained rescuers on the entire coast, were not exempt from the trap they had sworn to reach into. And it does not always take a storm at all. Sometimes the bar takes a ship in a flat calm, in nothing worse than fog, just to remind everyone that the real danger is the ground itself. On the evening of the 15th of February, 1930, the passenger steamer Admiral Benson came in toward the Columbia inbound from San Francisco for Portland, carrying 39 passengers and 65 crew. The weather was mild, the sea was quiet. The only trouble was a dense fog that had blotted out the coast. And in that fog, a little before 7 in the evening, the Admiral Benson slid gently aground on Peacock Spit, a quarter of a mile from the brand new North Jetty, the very engineering that had been built to make this crossing safe. There was at first no drama at all. The grounding was so soft and the ship so undamaged that her captain, Charles Graham, did not even send a distress call. He simply requested assistance to haul her off. She was aground in calm water beside a jetty with 100 people aboard, and it looked like an inconvenience. It was not an inconvenience. It was Peacock Spit, and Peacock Spit does not let go. The attempts to refloat her at high tide failed, and the sea, which had been merciful for a day, began to build, exactly as it always eventually does here in winter. Now the gentle grounding was a ship being worked by rising surf on the same shoal that had already killed the Peacock and the Rosecrans, with 104 souls aboard. This is where the rescue service earned its existence. Over the days that followed, Coast Guard surf boats from the life-saving stations at Point Adams and Cape Disappointment ran out to the stranded ship again and again, taking off the passengers and the non-essential crew a boatload at a time, 34 of them, on the first day alone. As the weather worsened, they went back for the rest, the last 5 passengers, and most of the remaining crew, and the very last men came off not by boat at all, but by Breach's buoy, a canvas seat slung on a rope, rigged between the wreck and the shore, each man riding across one at a time above the breaking water. Every single person aboard the Admiral Benson lived. The ship did not. She stayed on the Spit and broke up where the fog had left her. Hold those two outcomes together, because the bar is about to tear them apart. The Admiral Benson, aground in calm fog, rescued over days by surf boat and Breach's buoy, everyone saved, ship lost. That is what the bar does when it grounds you gently and gives the rescuers time to work. Now watch what the very same shoal does when it gives them no time at all, because 6 years later, almost to the week, it delivered the purest demonstration it ever gave of the one thing none of the new technology could fix. It happened on the 12th of January, 1936, and if you remember only one date from this entire story, make it that one, because the bar is going to use it twice. By 1936, the ships had improved yet again. The Peter Iredale had been sail. The Rosecrans had been an early powered tanker. The SS Iowa was a steam freighter, an engine-driven steel cargo ship better than 300 feet long, exactly the modern vessel that was supposed to have put the whole helpless age of wrecks behind it. And she carried a wireless, too. On the night of the 11th into the 12th of January, 1936, the Iowa left Portland outbound, headed down the coast toward San Francisco and onto the Atlantic loaded with cargo, carrying 34 men. She crossed the bar in about the worst circumstances the river can arrange. A ferocious winter gale had come up, winds estimated around 75 miles an hour, a full storm hitting the mouth of the Columbia head-on. She was outbound, which means she was crossing out against the ocean, in darkness, in a screaming wind, in the dead of the winter season, when the bar is at its most murderous. Exactly the direction and exactly the conditions the whole physics of this place is built to punish. Somewhere in that violence, she was driven off her line and onto Peacock Spit, the same shoal. The third time now in this story that the same tongue of sand has appeared, and it will not be the last. Watch, one more time, what the modern miracle could and could not do. The Iowa had a radio. Her operator got a distress signal out into the storm. People on shore knew she was in trouble, knew roughly where she was, knew that 34 men were aboard a freighter breaking up on the Spit. The message got through. That was the thing that was supposed to change the ending. In the age of the Peacock, a ship dying on the bar was utterly alone with her fate. No one on land even knew until the wreckage washed in. Now a ship could reach out and be heard while she was still dying. The Iowa was heard. It changed nothing. It changed absolutely nothing. And that is the entire point of her. The same storm that put the Iowa on the spit made it flatly impossible for any rescue vessel to reach her. To get to the Iowa, you had to cross the very same breaking, 75-mile-an-hour water that was killing her, and no boat that existed could do that and live. Coast Guard vessels tried to work the area, aircraft searched, beach patrols walked the sand looking for anyone who might come ashore. And every one of them hit the same wall the Rosecrans rescuers had hit. The water between the would-be rescuers and the wreck was every bit as lethal as the wreck itself. The Iowa's hull came apart in the surf over Peacock Spit, and all 34 men aboard died. Only 10 of their bodies were ever recovered, picked out of the flotsam scattered down the beaches. By the count of lives, the wreck of the SS Iowa remains the worst single shipwreck of the 20th century on the Columbia Bar. For days afterward, the search dragged on along that coast. Coast Guard crews worked the water where they could, aircraft flew the shoreline, and beach patrols walked mile after mile of sand, no longer looking for survivors, because everyone understood by then that there would be none, but looking for the men themselves, for whatever the surf chose to give back. It gave back 10 of the 34, scattered through the wreckage down the beaches, and it kept the other 24. Somewhere in the first hours of it, the Iowa's radio operator had sat at his set in a ship that was already breaking apart and sent out the plain fact of their dying, clearly, in time for the whole coast to hear it. And it bought them nothing at all, because there was no answer that could physically be made. That is the specific cruelty the Iowa proved. It is one thing to die unseen and unheard, the way ships died in the age of sail. It is another thing entirely to be heard exactly by people who want, with everything they have, to help you, and to die anyway, because the water between you and them simply will not permit the crossing. And notice one more time exactly where she died. Peacock Spit, the same submerged tongue of sand that had wrecked the USS Peacock back in 1841 had taken the Rosecrans in 1913, then grounded and destroyed the Admiral Benson in 1930, and now it had broken the Iowa in 1936, 3 of those losses inside a single generation. One shoal, reaching out from the north side of the entrance into the dark, had by then claimed a Navy warship, an oil tanker, a passenger steamer, and a freighter, across nearly a century, in fair weather and in storms. That is the thing to understand about the names on this map. Peacock Spit is not a place where ships happen to wreck. It is a place that wrecks ships again and again whenever the water and the timing line up against a vessel. And it has been doing exactly that for as long as anyone has kept the count. Set her beside the Peter Iredale, because together they say the whole thing without another word. The Peter Iredale, sail 1906, aground on an open beach in reachable water, 27 aboard, every soul lived. The SS Iowa, steam 1936, aground on the Killing Shoal in unreachable water, 34 aboard, every soul died. The Iowa was the newer ship, the stronger ship, the better equipped ship, and she had the radio the Iredale never dreamed of. She lost every man because the one thing the technology had improved, the ability to call for help, was not the thing that kills people on this bar. What kills people here is distance measured in breaking waves, and a radio does not shorten that distance by a single foot. The Iowa could tell the entire world she was dying. She could not make the world able to reach her. A distress call is not a rescue. It is a message that arrives at a door nobody alive can open. That gap between hearing the call and being physically able to answer it is where the darkest chapter of this whole story finally arrives. Because eventually, men built boats and trained themselves specifically to cross that lethal water, to go where the Iowa's would-be rescuers could not, to answer the calls that had always been death sentences. The Coast Guard learned to launch into the exact surf everyone else fled. They built self-righting motor lifeboats designed to roll completely upside down and come back upright. Boats meant to survive being thrown end over end by a breaking sea. And the bar, in the cruelest lesson it has ever taught, proved that it could kill those men too. The date, by a coincidence so exact it feels engineered, was the 12th of January again, 25 years to the day after the Iowa. 1961? It started with the smallest thing imaginable. The Mermaid was a little commercial crab boat, and on the afternoon of the 12th of January 1961, she crossed the Columbia Bar outbound to fish. The bar that day was rough, but crossable, the ordinary hard conditions the local boats worked in all the time. She got outside, and then, a little after 4 in the afternoon, her rudder broke. That is the whole beginning of the disaster, and I want you to notice how small it is, because the bar does not need much. Not a hurricane, not a navigation blunder, a steering failure, a mechanical fault that on a calm day is an annoyance and a slow tow home. But the Mermaid was now a boat that could not steer, sitting off the mouth of the Columbia, with the seas building toward 20 and 30 feet, and the wind climbing toward 70 miles an hour, and the winter dark coming down. A boat that cannot steer, cannot hold its bow into the waves. It falls off sideways into the trough, and a small boat sideways to a breaking sea is a boat about to be rolled over. The 2 men aboard got a call out. Their rudder was gone. They needed help. The Coast Guard station at Point Adams, on the Oregon side, answered, and here you have to understand what those men were and what they were being asked to do. The motor lifeboat crews of the Columbia Bar were, and still are, among the finest heavy surf small boat handlers in the world, precisely because they train and work in the worst surf in the country. Their boats were built for this exact fight, self-righting, meant to take a rollover and recover. If any rescuers on Earth could go into that water and come back out, it was these men, in these boats. So they went, and not one boat but a whole cascade of them, and each one pulled more men into the trap. A 40-foot utility boat went out and was capsized by the breakers. Her crew was recovered, but the boat was gone. A 36-foot motor lifeboat went into the fight and was hammered by the seas. Understand what was happening out there as this unfolded, because it was not one clean rescue but a long, escalating night of them, in darkness, in a rising storm, with more and more men and boats drawn into the same stretch of breaking water. Boat after boat went out from the stations at the mouth of the river. Men were thrown into the sea and pulled back out of it. Crews fought to hold a tow, lost it, and fought to get it back. Every boat that went in to help the boat already in trouble became, in its turn, another boat in trouble, because there was no way to reach the Mermaid except to enter the same water that had crippled her. The bar did not distinguish between the fishermen and the rescuers, or between a small crab boat and a purpose-built Coast Guard lifeboat. It applied the same physics to all of them, and it applied it in the dark, where a coxswain often could not see the wave that was about to end him until it was already standing over the boat. And then the 52-foot motor lifeboat Triumph, designated CG 52301, one of the big, powerful, heavy-weather boats, took the crippled Mermaid under tow and tried to bring her back in across the bar. They very nearly did it. The Triumph had the Mermaid on a line and was working her toward safety. And then a single heavy breaker, one wave out of the thousands, found the Triumph. It parted the tow line, cutting the 2 boats apart, and it rolled the Triumph over. 6 men were aboard the Triumph. 5 of them drowned. The boat was a self-righting design built to survive precisely this, and it did roll back upright, and it did not save them, because surviving a capsize means nothing at all if the sea has torn you out of the boat before it comes back up. 1 man from the Triumph lived. His name was Gordon Huggins, an engineman, and he was found later, alive, fighting for his life in the surf off Benson Beach on the Washington side, washed clear across the entire mouth of the river by the seas. He was pulled out and carried to the hospital at Ilwaco. He was the only survivor of the Triumph's crew, and he would carry that night for the rest of his life. Decades later, an old man, he was honored by the Coast Guard as the sole survivor of the Triumph, the last living link to a night when 5 of his crewmates drowned trying to save 2 fishermen. The men who died are remembered too, their names kept by the service that lost them, because the Coast Guard does not forget the Triumph, and it makes very sure its new surfmen never do. Every crew that trains on that bar today does so in the shadow of what happened to the best boat and the best men the service could send on an ordinary rescue on a rough but crossable winter afternoon, undone by a single broken rudder and one bad wave. And the Mermaid, the boat this all began for, the 2 fishermen everyone had gone out to save? After the tow parted, she too was lost, and both of her crew died. When it was finally over, 7 men were dead. 5 Coast Guardsmen who had gone out to bring back 2 fishermen, and the 2 fishermen they had gone out to bring back. The precise order of that night, which boat was lost when, the exact sequence as one wave led to the next, has been told a little differently in different accounts over the years, and some of those details remain genuinely uncertain, the way they always are when the only witnesses are scattered across miles of storm in the dark. What is not uncertain is the arithmetic. A broken rudder on a small crab boat pulled 7 men to their deaths, 5 of them the very people whose entire job was to make sure. That did not happen. That is the reversal this whole place has been building toward. From the first sentence, the bar does not only kill the people who cross it, it kills the people who come to save the people who cross it. The rescuers cannot be made exempt, because to reach a boat dying in the surf, you have to enter the surf. And the surf does not know and does not care that you came to help. Communication had improved beyond anything the Iowa's generation could have imagined. The radios worked, the call went out, help launched within minutes, trained men in purpose-built boats, and it did not save them. For the exact same reason it had not saved the Iowa in 1936 or the Rosecrans in 1913. The distance that kills you at the mouth of the Columbia is not measured in miles, and it never has been. It is measured in breaking waves, and no amount of speed, no radio, no self-righting hull, and no courage shortens that distance by an inch. The Triumph disaster changed the Coast Guard, and it changed it in a way that is bleakly true to this whole place. The loss forced hard questions about how these rescues were run, about tactics and limits and the boats themselves, and one lasting answer was a new generation of motor lifeboat. Within a couple of years, the Coast Guard introduced the 44-foot motor lifeboat, and later the 47-foot boat that works these waters today, tougher, more capable heavy-weather craft descended directly from the lessons of nights like that one. The lessons went deeper than the boats, though. They forced the service to think harder about when a crew should launch and when a rescue attempt is about to become a second disaster stacked on the first, about how to weigh the lives of the people already in the water against the lives of the people you are about to send in after them. That is an agonizing calculation. And there is no clean formula for it because the entire identity of the service is built on going out. But part of what came out of nights like the Triumphs was a colder, more deliberate professionalism about the limits of even the best boat and the best crew, an understanding that courage is necessary and is not sufficient, and that the bar will punish a reckless launch exactly as hard as it punishes a reckless crossing. But notice what the institution did not do. It did not decide the bar was too dangerous and pull back from it. It decided the opposite. If men were going to have to keep going into the worst surf on the coast, then they were going to be the most rigorously trained surf boat handlers on the face of the earth before they did it. Which is why, if you go to Cape Disappointment today, on the Washington side of the entrance, on the same headland Mears named for his own failure. You will find something that exists nowhere else in the United States. The National Motor Lifeboat School, established in 1968, the only school in the entire country that trains crews specifically for heavy weather surf rescue. And the reason it sits on this exact spot is the same reason everything else in this story sits here. The water is the worst in the country. That is not a drawback the school puts up with. That is the entire point of the school. Students come here from across the Coast Guard and from the life-saving services of other nations, Canada, Britain, Norway, and more, up to about 150 of them a year, to train in a place where the waves off the Cape regularly top 20 feet, and the school deliberately runs its hardest instruction in winter on purpose, because winter is when the bar is at its worst. And there is no point learning to survive the worst water in the country in the summer when it is only pretending to be dangerous. They take their boats out into the same breaking seas off Cape Disappointment that killed the Triumph's crew, again and again, learning to read a sea that stacks and pitches and throws sneakers without warning, learning by feel exactly where a boat can go and where it absolutely cannot, learning the precise moving edge of survivable. The qualification they are working toward is called Surfman, and it is one of the oldest and rarest badges in American maritime service. To earn it, you have to prove, in real surf, that you can take a small boat into water that would kill almost anyone else and bring it and your crew back out. The training itself is deliberately brutal, and it is meant to be. Students take the boats out into breaking surf in daylight and then again in the dark, learning to drive straight at a wall of white water and punch through it, learning what it feels like when the boat goes light underneath them and the bow rears up and the whole world tips past level, learning the exact posture of a boat about to be rolled and how to keep it from happening, or how to survive it when it does happen anyway. The boats are built to be capsized and to come back upright, and the crews have to learn to trust that in surf, at night, in winter, with the same shoals off the bow that are named for dead ships. Only a fraction of the people who ever pin on Coast Guard blue will earn the Surfman badge, and the ones who do are qualified to take a rescue boat into conditions that shut down every other kind of vessel afloat. That is the institution the bar built. Not a warning sign, not a fence, not a closed sign on the door, but a school whose graduates are trained to go precisely where the warning signs point, on the worst nights of the year, because someone has to, and this bar guarantees that sooner or later someone always will. Think hard about what that institution actually is. It is a monument built out of disasters exactly like the Triumph, and its entire mission is to send human beings straight back into the water that created it. The bar killed enough rescuers that the Coast Guard's considered response was to build a permanent national school for making better rescuers, and then to place that school directly in the killing water, on purpose, forever. The danger here was never solved. It was institutionalized. It became a fixed, funded, permanent feature of the American coast, a place where every winter, deliberately, people drive boats into walls of white water so that they will be ready the day a real call comes in over the radio. And the real calls still come because the trap is still open every single day. And the Cape Disappointment Station remains one of the busiest search and rescue units in the entire Coast Guard. So now step all the way into the present, into the age that most believes it has this beaten, because that belief is its own kind of danger, and the bar is patient with it. Today, a giant container ship or bulk carrier bound for Portland does not gamble on the bar. As she approaches, a Columbia River bar pilot is lowered onto her deck, most often by helicopter, while she is still some 15 miles out at sea, well before she reaches the close, dangerous water. That pilot has spent years learning this one crossing and nothing else. He takes the con and carries her across the bar and up into the river. and then a river pilot takes her the rest of the way to port. Modern forecasting can now see a dangerous sea coming days out. Radar paints every hazard. Satellite navigation fixes the ship's position to within a few feet, and vessel traffic systems watch every ship in the approaches. The bar itself is opened and closed to traffic at the discretion of the United States Coast Guard, and the bar pilots suspend their own service when the conditions cross the line, so that on the worst days, the door is simply declared shut and the ships wait offshore, exactly as the fur traders once waited, because some things about this place do not change no matter what century it is. To grasp the scale of what those pilots do, put a number on it. Something on the order of 3,600 vessel crossings of the Columbia Bar every year pass under the hands of these pilots. Ships ranging from 100-foot tugs to 1,100-foot bulk carriers and tankers and car carriers and container ships, every one of them stopping to take a pilot aboard before it crosses. Roughly two-thirds of those pilots now arrive by helicopter, a fast twin-turbine machine that clatters out over the swell and lowers a single human being down onto a moving steel deck far out at sea, a piece of flying that is itself among the most demanding in the maritime world. The pilots themselves, and the people who study this water for a living, do not shy from calling it one of the most dangerous pilotage grounds anywhere on Earth, and the definitive history of their profession was published under the flat, unembellished title of the world's most dangerous. And still, with all of that 3,600 times a year, a pilot steps off the deck of a boat or drops from a helicopter and takes the wheel of a stranger's ship across the bar, because that is the only way the trade of an entire region gets in or out, and there is still no machine on Earth that can do the reading for them. Watch a single modern crossing, and you can see the whole 200-year argument resolve into a few quiet minutes of work. A container ship inbound for Portland slows in the swell miles offshore. A helicopter lifts off from the shore, clatters out over the gray water, and matches speed above the ship's deck, while a pilot is lowered onto it. And then the aircraft peels away, and the pilot climbs to the bridge and takes the con. He has already studied the tide. He knows to the minute when the ebb will slack, when the river will briefly stop fighting the sea, when the bar will be as close to gentle as it gets that day, and he times the ship's approach to hit that window. He watches the water. He knows where the channel actually runs this week, not where an old chart says it ought to. And he carries 1,100 feet of loaded steel across the bar in the one brief slot of the day, when the water allows it, and hands her off to a river pilot, and from the deck it looks like nothing happened at all. That is the whole triumph of the modern system, and it is a real triumph, and it is also entirely dependent on a human being who spent years learning to read one specific stretch of water, choosing not to cross when the window is wrong. Take away his judgment or his willingness to say no, and every instrument on that ship will carry her confidently onto the bar at exactly the wrong moment, the way instruments have carried better ships than her since the age of sail. 10,000 times that quiet crossing goes right, and you never hear a word about it, and that is exactly the point. The measure of how dangerous the bar still is was never the number of wrecks. It is the size of the machine we have to run every single day to keep the wrecks from happening. 3,600 piloted crossings a year, a helicopter and 2 pilot boats, a national school for surf rescue, a Coast Guard station that never really sleeps, jetties we bleed money to keep standing, and a standing willingness to slam the whole door shut the moment the water demands it. All of that, continuously, just to make a 3-mile crossing look boring. Let any single piece of it lapse, and the bar is right there, exactly as it always was, waiting. And every one of those tools is real, and every one of them has a hard edge past which it does nothing. And the honest version of this story is the one that holds both of those facts at once. The helicopter that lowers a pilot onto a ship 15 miles out is a genuine advance over the old rope ladder transfer that killed and maimed pilots for generations, and it means fewer pilots die getting aboard. It does nothing whatever to the waves once the ship is on the bar. The lightship that marked the entrance for the better part of a century, riding out storms on her anchor so a light would burn where no rock could hold one, was finally retired in 1979 and replaced by a large automated navigation buoy, which never needs a crew and never gets a man killed holding it in place, and which also cannot pull a single soul out of the surf. Forecasting can warn a captain that a killing sea is on the way, and that warning saves ships that can still turn back, and it is worth nothing at all to a boat already committed to the crossing, or already broken down on the bar with the ebb running. And when the forecast is bad enough, the modern answer is the same answer the Chinook gave, only dressed in official clothes. You do not go. The Coast Guard closes the bar. The pilots suspend their service. Ships stack up offshore and inside the river, waiting, sometimes for days. And every one of those days costs somebody a great deal of money, which is precisely the pressure that has always tempted people to cross anyway. The modern system's real achievement is not that it conquered the bar. It is that it built the institutional nerve to keep the door shut when the water says shut, and to swallow the cost of waiting rather than pay the older, worse cost of crossing. That restraint is the single most valuable piece of safety equipment at the mouth of the Columbia, and it is not a machine at all. It is a decision made by people willing to say no, which is the one thing the Chinook understood from the very beginning, and everyone else has had to relearn at a price. The engine that freed ships from the wind, carries them out in weather sail, would have fled. The jetties that hold the channel steepen the seas that break over it. Every tool solved a real problem and left the core of the trap exactly where it found it. You can measure how open the trap still is by who it still takes. The big ships, piloted and tracked and forecast, rarely come to grief on the bar anymore, and that is a genuine achievement worth naming. But the bar never fed mostly on the big ships. It feeds on the small boats, the commercial fishermen chasing a season, and the recreational boaters who look at the bar on a fair morning and see exactly what John Mears saw in reverse, an entrance that does not look like it could possibly be that bad. The Coast Guard crews out of Cape Disappointment and across the river still launch into that water to pull people off disabled boats, still run the same fundamental rescue the Triumph ran, and the ocean between the rescuer and the victim is still measured in breaking waves and not in miles. The specific boats and the specific years change. The physics has not changed since before there were charts. If you spend a single winter within earshot of that bar, you will hear the whole pattern repeat in miniature, over and over. A crab boat loses power on the ebb and begins to drift toward the breakers. A sport fishing skipper who has crossed 100 times gets caught by a set of sneakers standing up where the water looked open and safe. A small boat trying to beat a building sea home meets the bar at exactly the wrong stage of the tide. And the same alarm goes out that has been going out for more than a century, and the same crews launch from Cape Disappointment into the same water, in boats now designed to roll all the way over and drive themselves back upright. And most of the time, because those crews are extraordinarily good at a thing almost no one else on Earth practices, they bring the people home. Sometimes they do not. The station at the mouth of the Columbia remains one of the busiest search and rescue units in the entire Coast Guard, and it is busy for the oldest reason there is. People still have to cross, or want to cross, and the bar still turns on them faster than help can arrive. The equipment on both sides keeps getting better. The gap between the call and the rescue, measured in breaking waves, stays exactly the width it has always been. So stand back now and look at the entire machine at once, because by this point every part of it is on the table, and the way they lock together is the real, complete answer to the question we started with. The reason a river mouth you could throw a stone across kills people that an open ocean a few miles offshore would let pass. Geography sets the trap and never releases it. A continent-draining river and an open ocean forced together through a gap barely 3 miles wide. You cannot move the river and you cannot move the ocean. So the constraint is permanent, older than any nation that has ever claimed the place. The river arms the trap. 250,000 cubic feet a second and far more in spring, dumping the sediment that builds the shifting bar and driving the ebb current that stacks the incoming swell into walls. That force runs day and night and has run for 10,000 years and will run for 10,000 more, indifferent to every one of us. The weather springs the trap. The North Pacific throws storm swell at this coast with nothing to slow it, and in winter it does so relentlessly, and the worst of it arrives at exactly the season when boats still need to cross, so the permanent trap becomes an active one on any given bad day. The moving sand keeps the trap hidden. The bottom rearranges itself with every big storm, so the safe water is never permanently mapped, which is why, in an age when we can land a machine on another planet, this river still requires living human beings to go out to every ship and take the wheel across. Because knowing where you are was never the problem. Where the safe water has moved to is the problem, and only someone who reads this exact bar every single day can keep up with it. Human need keeps the trap loaded. The wealth of an entire region, the wheat and the timber and the fish, and now the container traffic of the whole Pacific Northwest, all of it still has to pass through this one door. And it still does, because the river is dangerous for the same reason it is valuable. And those were always the same sentence. The reason to come here has never once gone away, so the exposure has never once gone away. And it is not a smaller thing today than it was in the age of sail. If anything, it is larger. The ports up the Columbia move enormous volumes of the nation's wheat and other bulk exports out to the world, along with cars and containers and cargo of every kind, and every ton of it rides across that bar on a ship that had to cross the graveyard to reach the dock and will have to cross it again to leave. The whole modern supply chain of a large piece of the Pacific Northwest still hinges at one specific choke point, on ships passing safely over the same water that took the Peacock and the Iowa. We have not outgrown the bar. We have loaded more onto it than ever. Larger ships, more of them, carrying more value, and then handed the entire risk to the small group of pilots and rescue crews who spend their lives at that one crossing, so that the rest of us never have to think about it. Technology changes what people dare, without changing what the bar can do to them. Every tool we ever built here, the pilot, and the lighthouse, and the jetty, and the engine, and the radio, and the helicopter, and the forecast, solved a real danger and quietly enlarged another, or left the center of the trap untouched. And every generation has had to relearn at a price that improved capability is not the same as safety, and often just carries people confidently a little deeper in. And distance decides who lives, the kind of distance measured in breaking waves. That is the thread that ties the Rosecrans in 1913 to the Iowa in 1936 to the Triumph in 1961, and to every rescue that will ever launch from this shore. You can hear the call. You can be minutes away. You can have the best boats and the best trained crews the world has ever produced. And between you and the people dying, there is a stretch of water that will kill anything that enters it in the wrong condition. And that stretch does not shrink for anyone. Not for a merchant, not for a mariner, not for the Coast Guard, not for you. That is the system. Geography sets the trap. The river arms it. The weather springs it. The moving sand hides it. Human need keeps sending people into it. Technology changes what people attempt without changing what the bar can do. And distance decides who can be saved and who cannot. Every wreck in this story is that same machine running once more in a new era with better equipment to the same ending. The Peacock proved a great ship is not enough. The pilots proved local knowledge helps and never guarantees. The Desdemona proved that skipping the safeguard kills you in the calm water. The Great Republic proved a pilot is a human being who can be wrong, and that the bar collects its dead even in a rescue. The lights proved you can see the trap perfectly and still not escape it. The jetties proved you can rebuild the very mouth of the river and not calm it. The Peter Iredale proved steel changes only how you lose. The Rosecrans and the Iowa proved a call for help is not help. And the Triumph proved that the men who go in to save the rest of us are not spared either. None of it is a mystery, and that is the part that should stay with you longest. There is no curse here, no legend, nothing supernatural, nothing hidden. Everything that has ever killed anyone on the Columbia Bar is measurable and known. The flow of the river in cubic feet per second, the speed of the ebb in knots, the height of the swell in feet, the depth of the sand that shifts with the season, the number of minutes it takes a boat to launch, and the number of waves between that boat and the people it is trying to reach. Every death here is the arithmetic of moving water, worked out in real time, with human lives as the only variable in the equation. And that, in the end, is what makes this place worth understanding rather than only fearing. The Columbia Bar is not cruel because it is not anything. It has no intention, no memory, no appetite, whatever the old name whispers. It is a gap 3 miles wide, where a continent's river meets an ocean's swell over a floor of moving sand. And everything that has ever happened there, every ship saved and every ship lost, every rescue and every drowning, is the completely explicable result of forces we can name and measure, and, in part, even predict. What we cannot do is switch them off. We have lit the entrance, rebuilt its mouth, dammed its river, put a pilot on every ship and some of the finest rescue crews on Earth on the shore, and the bar is exactly as capable of killing you today as it was the day the Peacock went to pieces on the spit that now carries her name. The knowledge does not make it safe. It only makes it comprehensible. And there is a kind of respect in that comprehension that fear by itself never reaches. A recognition that the people who died here mostly were not careless or doomed. They were ordinary people who ran the same arithmetic any of us would have run, and lost, on the wrong side of a few minutes, or a few feet, or one wave out of the thousands. And the arithmetic has not changed. Right now, as you hear this, the Columbia is still shoving 250,000 cubic feet of water every second out through that 3-mile gap. The ebb is still running against the swell 6 hours out of every 12. The sand is still moving on the bottom. The pilots are still going out to every ship, dropping from a helicopter onto a steel deck 15 miles at sea, taking a wheel that is not theirs across the one stretch of the voyage the captain is not permitted to handle alone. And every winter, off Cape Disappointment, on purpose, Coast Guard crews still drive their boats out into the breaking water to be ready for the call that is always, eventually, coming. Hold that picture as we come back to the present. It is winter, the season the bar keeps its worst self, and out past Cape Disappointment the seas are running 20 feet and breaking, and there are boats out in it on purpose. Orange-hulled Coast Guard motor lifeboats driving straight into walls of white water, climbing them, punching through them, sometimes heeling so far the crew can see nothing but foam, and coming back upright and turning around to do it again. No one is in distress. No call has come. These are trainees and their instructors, rehearsing the worst night of someone's future, in the exact water that killed the Triumph's crew, because the whole grim logic of this place is that the call will come, and when it does, the only thing standing between a stranger in the surf and the bottom of the sea will be a crew that already knows, in their hands and their stomachs, what this water does. That is what it takes to live alongside the Columbia Bar, not defeating it, practicing forever for the next time it opens. Picture the last frame then, because it holds the whole thing at once. A cargo ship stands off the mouth of the Columbia in the gray light, waiting her turn, and a bar pilot rides out and goes aboard to carry her across, over the same line of water where Robert Gray drove the Columbia Rediviva through the breakers in the spring of 1792, on a day the bar is open and the sea allows it. A few miles south, half buried in the sand of Clatsop Spit, the rusted ribs of the Peter Iredale sit exactly where the surf left them more than a century ago, while families walk out at low tide to lay their hands on the iron and take their pictures. Both of those things are true at the same moment, on the same day, at the same river mouth, the ship going safely across, guided by a man who reads the water. And the wreck on the beach, proof of what waits for the ones the water does not allow. The machine is still running. The door still opens and closes on its own schedule, answering to nothing we have ever built. And the ships still line up to go through it, because on the far side is everything they came for, exactly as it always was, and exactly as it always will be.